a cry for hope. In a village nestled between towering trees and vast, untamed forest, lived Omoera, a woman of strength, love, and quiet sorrow. Her home was simple but warm, tucked away at the edge of the village, where the trees whispered secrets to the wind. Kofi, her devoted husband, worked as a farmer, tending to the land and the animals that sustained them. Their life, while peaceful, was overshadowed by one constant ache that neither could escape. Omoera could not conceive a child. For years, the two had tried everything within their power to bring a child into their home. Herbal remedies from the village healers, prayers to the gods, and even visits to distant spiritual leaders had all proven fruitless. The silence in her womb grew louder with every passing month, a reminder of her failure, despite her deep longing to become a mother. The villagers, once compassionate, had begun to murmur behind her back. Amora's inability to bear a child became the topic of gossip, and whispers seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her mother-in-law, Ohinwa, was the loudest of the critics. Ohinwa had always been a harsh woman, her words sharp and biting, but now they were laced with cruelty. A barren seed will never grow, Kofi, Ohinwa would say, casting cold glances at Omoera. Perhaps it is time for him to find a new wife, one who can bear him sons. Each of these words felt like a dagger to Amora's heart. Kofi, who had always been kind and loving, grew increasingly distant as the pressure mounted. His family's demands weighed heavily on him, and he had begun to entertain the idea of marrying another woman, much to Amora's despair. Amora's heart shattered, for she knew that no matter what she tried, her womb remained silent. The shame of being unable to bear children was unbearable, and it felt like a constant weight pressing down on her chest. The whispers of the village, the harsh words of her mother-in-law, and the growing distance between her and Kofi slowly eroded her hope. One evening, as Omoera sat alone by the fire, her hands trembling as she tried to prepare the evening meal, a thought crossed her mind, a whisper in the back of her mind that she had long been too afraid to entertain. It was a story she had heard in passing, one that chilled her to the bone yet beckoned her with the promise of a miracle. There were rumors of Nana Asantewa, an ancient sorceress who lived deep within the forest, a woman said to possess powers that could bend the very fabric of life and death. Nana Asantewa was a figure both feared and revered, for it was said that she could grant the greatest desires of the heart, but always at a price. The forest spirits were said to be her servants, and they whispered that she could give life to the barren and cure ailments no healer could touch. But the cost was steep. No one who sought her help ever returned unchanged. People who had gone to her temple in the forest spoke of terrible bargains, of souls being sacrificed for wishes granted. Yet, despite the warnings, Amora's heart was filled with desperate hope. Could Nana Asantewa help her become a mother? Could she fulfill the one dream that had been out of her reach for so long? Omoera knew the risks. She had heard the stories of those who had paid the price. But the fear of losing Kofi to another woman, the shame of being called the barren, and the longing to have a child of her own overwhelmed all other thoughts. She had exhausted all other options, and there was only one path left. That night, under the eerie glow of a full moon, Omoera packed a small bag with food, water, and a few belongings for the journey ahead. She wrapped herself in a heavy cloak to protect against the cold of the night air and said a silent prayer for guidance. Omoera didn't know what would await her in the forest, nor did she understand the full weight of what she was about to do. But her heart was resolute. She would do anything to become a mother. With one final look at her small, empty house, Omoera stepped into the unknown. The village was still and quiet, with only the sound of rustling leaves breaking the silence. The moon was full above her, casting an ethereal light on the path ahead. Her steps echoed in the stillness, each footfall taking her further into the woods and closer to the sorceress Nana Asantewa. The journey would not be easy. The forest was known to be treacherous and alive with ancient spirits, and the path to Nana Asantewa's temple was fraught with danger. But Omoera did not hesitate. Every step she took was a step toward a chance at the life she had always dreamed of. With the whispers of her mother-in-law's harsh words ringing in her ears, and the weight of her own aching heart pushing her forward, Omaira pressed on, determined to do whatever it took to fulfill her desperate cry for hope, the dangerous path. As Omaira made her way into the dense forest, the world around her seemed to hold its breath. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their dark forms stretching into the night sky, and the soft rustle of unseen creatures filled the air with an eerie tension. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting strange shadows that danced across the forest floor. The path was narrow, winding through thick underbrush, and every step Omaira took felt as though the forest itself was watching her. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, a sharp contrast to the fresh, open air of the village she had left behind. Each creaking branch, each distant call of an owl, seemed to carry with it a warning. The deeper she ventured into the forest, the more her heart pounded, the more the weight of her decision seemed to settle upon her. Omaira was no stranger to the forest, but tonight, the world felt different. She had heard stories, of course. Stories passed down from the elders, whispered in hushed tones around the village fires. The forest, they said, was alive with ancient magic, and Nana Asantewa was a sorceress whose power was said to be as old as the earth itself. Some claimed she could grant any wish, but at a terrible cost. Those who had sought her out before had not returned the same. Some had disappeared without a trace, while others returned, their minds broken, their spirits fractured. The elders warned that Nana Asantewa was not to be trusted, for she gave only what the spirits allowed, and the price of her gift was often far too high. Yet, despite the stories that swirled around the village like a dark cloud, Amora's desperation outweighed her fear. She had come this far. She could not turn back now. With every step, the whispers of her mother-in-law's cruel words seemed to push her onward. "You will never be enough." The words echoed in her mind, and she clenched her fists, silencing them with every stride. Hours seemed to pass, or perhaps only minutes. It was hard to tell in the heavy, dreamlike atmosphere of the forest. But just as Omaira began to feel as though she might lose her way, the trees began to thin, and a soft light flickered ahead. She quickened her pace, heart racing, and soon, the dark, towering trees opened up to reveal something far more wondrous, and far more terrifying, than she had imagined. She had reached the edge of a sacred grove. The ground beneath her feet was softer here, and the air hummed with a strange energy, as though the very earth was alive with power. The moonlight bathed the grove in an ethereal glow, casting everything in a silvery sheen. In the center of the grove stood the entrance to Nana Asantewa's temple, hidden deep within the heart of the forest. The temple's walls shimmered, not with stone or wood, but with intricate carvings of serpents, their bodies winding in and out of the surface, their eyes etched with wisdom and ancient power. The symbols were not of any language Omaira knew, yet they seemed to pulse with meaning, as if speaking to her soul directly. The air felt thick and charged, as though the very stones of the temple were alive, watching her, waiting for her arrival. Omaira stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, her breath shallow as she crossed the threshold of the temple. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of incense and something deeper, something older. The light was dim, but in the shadows, Omaira could make out the figure of the sorceress. There, sitting atop a raised platform, was Nana Asantewa. The sorceress was a sight to behold, her body draped in robes woven with the colors of the forest, greens, browns, and golds, blending into the surroundings as if she were one with the earth. Her skin seemed to glow faintly in the low light, as though lit from within by some ethereal force. Her eyes were like molten gold, gleaming with ancient wisdom, and in the shadows around her, glowing serpents coiled lazily, their eyes fixed on Omaira with a knowing gaze. Omaira felt a shiver of both awe and fear, but she stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. Nana Asantewa's voice echoed in the temple, a deep and hypnotic tone that seemed to reverberate through the very stones beneath Omaira's feet. I know why you are here, Omara, the sorceress said, her words slow and deliberate. You seek to change your fate. To bend the will of the spirits and bring life where none has grown. Amora's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. Please. I beg you, Nana Asantewa. I want a child. My heart is empty without one, and my marriage is slipping away. I will do anything to fulfill my dream. Nana Asantewa rose from her throne, her movements as fluid as the serpents that surrounded her. The serpents hissed softly, their bodies shifting like shadows around her. As she walked toward Omara, her golden eyes never left her. A child, the sorceress mused, her voice like the wind rustling through the trees. A gift and a curse. A child is a bond, a piece of your soul-giving form. To bear one is to offer up your very essence. Are you prepared for the cost? Omara swallowed, the weight of her desperation pressing down on her chest. Yes, she whispered, her voice shaking but steady. I am ready to do anything. Nana Asantewa smiled faintly, her lips curving with an ancient, knowing grace. She extended her hand, and in it was a small, clay statue, delicately crafted with intricate markings and symbols that Omara could not understand. The eyes of the statue were hollow, yet somehow, they seemed to glow faintly, as if watching her. This is the vessel of life, Nana Asantewa explained, her voice low and heavy. Take it with you, Omara. Place it under your pillow tonight, and whisper these words, from my soul, I give life. But know this, what the vessel gives, it may also take. If you neglect this child, if you fail to love them as you would your own soul, the vessel will reclaim what is its own. Omara reached out, her hands trembling as she took the statue from Nana Asantewa. The weight of it was light, but the power it seemed to carry made her feel as though she were holding the very essence of life in her hands. I will love my child, Omara promised, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and fear. With all my heart. The sorceress nodded slowly, her golden eyes piercing into Amora's soul. The serpent watches always, she whispered cryptically, before turning away, returning to her throne, her serpents trailing behind her like shadows. Amara stood for a moment, the weight of the sorceress's words pressing on her mind, but the hope in her heart outweighed the fear. She had made her choice. With the clay statue clutched tightly in her hands, Omara left the temple, her mind swirling with uncertainty, but also a deep, abiding hope. She would do anything for a child. And now, she would face the consequences of that decision. A blessing born. The night Omara performed the ritual, the world seemed to hold its breath. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light through the window of Amora's small home. With trembling hands, she placed the clay vessel under her pillow, exactly as Nana Asantewa had instructed. Then, with a voice that quivered in both fear and hope, she whispered the words. From my soul, I give life. The words seemed to hang in the air, as if the very earth around her had acknowledged her plea. As Omara lay down to sleep, her heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The sleep that followed was deep and dreamless, as though her soul itself was suspended in time. When she awoke the next morning, the vessel was gone. In its place, she felt an unfamiliar warmth blossoming within her, deep in her womb, as though a spark of life had been ignited where once there had been only emptiness. Amora's heart leapt in her chest, a rush of hope flooding her veins. It was real. The promise Nana Asantewa had made to her had been fulfilled. For months after, Omara felt her body change, and with every passing day, the small life within her grew stronger. She sought no further help, for the evidence of her success was clear. Her belly swelled with new life, and the once muted whispers of the villagers, who had doubted her and pitied her, shifted. They were no longer whispers of judgment, but of admiration. Her husband Kofi, who had once been distant and troubled by the pressures of their childless marriage, now looked at her with renewed affection. His eyes, once clouded with frustration and doubt, now shone with a warmth Omoera had not seen in years. "You're glowing, Omoera," he would say with a soft smile, his hand resting gently on her growing belly. The villagers, too, marveled at the change. Once, they had looked at her with sympathy, offering words of pity. But now, they saw her as a woman of strength and grace, whose prayers had been answered by the gods themselves. Omoera felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude, knowing that the path she had walked had led her to this miracle. Then, one bright morning, after months of anticipation, Omoera's time had come. The pain of labor was fierce, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming joy that coursed through her as she welcomed the beautiful baby girl into the world. The moment Omoera held her daughter in her arms, the overwhelming flood of love and relief nearly brought her to tears. She named the child Nia, meaning a purpose, for in her, Omoera saw the fulfillment of all her deepest desires, her prayers, and the very essence of her existence. Nia was everything Omoera had hoped for and more. She was healthy, with bright, curious eyes that seemed to take in the world with wonder. Her cries were strong, and her laughter, like the sound of 1,000 bells, filled Omoera's heart with joy. Every moment with Nia was a gift, a blessing beyond measure. The village erupted into celebration, as the news of the newborn spread like wildfire. The elders, who had once whispered cruelly behind Omoera's back, now smiled with admiration and respect. The village gathered to offer their blessings, bringing gifts of food, cloth, and well wishes. Kofi's pride was evident as he stood by Omoera, his hand resting on her shoulder as they watched their daughter sleep peacefully in her crib. Omoera felt as though her life had come full circle. The ache in her heart was gone, replaced by the warmth of Nia's tiny hand curled around her finger. She no longer felt the burden of shame or doubt. Her home, once empty, was now full of life, and her heart swelled with gratitude. But as the days passed, the reality of motherhood began to settle in. The joy of holding Nia close was often followed by the weariness of sleepless nights. The baby's cries at all hours of the night began to take their toll. Omoera had been warned of the exhaustion that motherhood would bring, but she had never imagined how overwhelming it could be. Nia's needs were endless. The feedings, the sleepless nights, the constant care, it was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Omoera found herself waking in the middle of the night, her body aching from the demands of motherhood, her eyes heavy with fatigue. As much as she loved her daughter, the pressure of being constantly needed began to wear on her. There were days when Omoera would sit in her small home, holding Nia in her arms, and feel a strange sense of loneliness, even though she was surrounded by love. The weight of her responsibilities sometimes made her wonder if she was truly ready for all that came with raising a child. The village that had once celebrated her success now expected her to be the perfect mother, the perfect woman. Kofi, too, was often away, walking the fields and attending to the demands of their small farm. Though he was loving and supportive, his absence at times left Omoera feeling isolated. The demands of motherhood became more than she had anticipated, and with every passing day, she found herself struggling to keep up with the endless list of tasks that awaited her. Omoera would often sit by the window, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, and wonder if she had made the right decision. She had prayed for a child, a life to call her own, a joy to fill her days. But in the quiet moments, when Nia was asleep, she would feel a pang of regret, a longing for the peace she had known before. It wasn't that she didn't love Nia, she did, more than anything in the world. But the weight of motherhood, the unrelenting demands, left her questioning how much of herself she had truly sacrificed. Was it worth it? Would she be able to fulfill the promise she had made to Nana Asantewa, to love this child with all her heart, no matter the cost? These thoughts, though fleeting, were enough to keep her up at night, wondering what the future held. Omoera knew she had to find balance, to give her daughter everything she needed without losing herself in the process. But for now, As she looked down at Nia, sleeping peacefully in her arms, Omoyara could not imagine her life without her. And for the first time in years, the emptiness in her heart seemed to fade away, replaced by a love so strong it felt like it could move mountains. Omoyara had her child. But the journey of motherhood had only just begun. The breaking point. The days stretched into years, and Amora's life had become a blur of sleepless nights, never-ending chores, and the constant demands of motherhood. Nia had grown into a lively and curious little girl, her energy boundless and her needs unrelenting. At first, Omoyara had embraced the chaos, fueled by the joy of having a child, by the fulfillment of the dream she had fought so hard for. But over time, the weight of constant care began to chip away at her. Every day felt the same, feeding, cleaning, tending to Nia's every whim. The quiet moments she had once cherished now seemed like distant memories, and instead of feeling blessed, Omoyara began to feel drained. The love she had once felt for Nia, the overwhelming, joyful bond, began to be overshadowed by exhaustion and frustration. Her body ached from the constant work, her mind clouded by worry. The village, once so welcoming, had grown indifferent. They expected Omoyara to be the perfect mother, always calm and composed, never showing signs of weakness. Kofi, too, was often gone, working the farm or attending to other responsibilities. Though he tried to help, his absence left Omoyara feeling isolated. The weight of the world seemed to fall on her shoulders alone. And then, there was Nia's constant neediness. Her daughter's endless demands were the final straw. Every morning, Nia seemed to wake up full of energy, pulling Omoyara from her sleep with cries for attention, food, play, or simply her presence. Omoyara tried to keep up, but her patience had worn thin, her spirit frayed. The love she felt for Nia began to feel suffocating, as if the child's needs were consuming her, leaving nothing for herself. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Omoyara snapped. The constant cry for attention, the endless tasks that never seemed to end, and the lack of help from anyone had pushed her to the edge. Nia, as usual, was tugging at her sleeve, asking for something, more food, a story, a game, and Omoyara, tired beyond measure, finally lost her temper. "Leave me alone for once, Nia," she shouted, her voice sharp and unkind. Her words hung in the air, the anger and frustration pouring out of her like a torrent. Nia froze, her eyes wide with shock, and then, with trembling hands, she clutched something tightly to her chest, a familiar, small clay doll, the same one Omoyara had received from Nana Asantewa so long ago. Omoyara didn't notice the doll at first. Her eyes were filled with fury, her mind clouded by the overwhelming sense of being trapped. She hadn't meant the words to come out the way they did, but in that moment, they felt justified. She was tired, more than she had ever been in her life. And for the first time in all these years, she resented her daughter's constant needs. Nia, startled and confused, turned and fled to her room, the sound of her small feet echoing through the house. Omoyara stood there, her chest heaving with breath, but as the moments passed, a sense of regret began to settle in her heart. She didn't want to hurt Nia, but the weight of motherhood had become too much to bear. She felt guilty, but too exhausted to reach out and apologize. The evening passed in silence, with Omoyara sitting by the fire, lost in thought. She hadn't meant what she'd said, but she didn't know how to fix the growing distance between her and Nia. Her heart ached as she thought about how much she had loved the child when she was born, how full her life had been with joy. But now, there was only exhaustion, regret, and a creeping feeling of resentment she had never expected to feel. That night, as the hours ticked by, Omoyara eventually drifted off to sleep, the weight of the day heavy on her mind. She didn't hear Nia's soft footsteps, nor the quiet hissing sound that echoed through the house. When Omoyara awoke the next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The sun had barely risen, and for a moment, Omoyara thought she had simply woken up too early. But as she listened, she realized the silence was unnatural. She called out for Nia, but there was no response. The house was still, as though frozen in time. Panic began to rise in Amora's chest. She rushed to Nia's room, but the little girl was nowhere to be found. The bed was empty, the sheets rumpled as though Nia had been there just moments before. Amora's heart raced as she searched frantically through the house. She called out again, but the silence was deafening. Nia's toys lay scattered on the floor, but there was no sign of her daughter anywhere. A cold sweat broke out on Amora's brow as she ran from room to room, calling Nia's name, her mind racing with fear and confusion. It wasn't until she turned toward Nia's small bed that she saw it, the clay doll. The doll, the one Nia had clutched so tightly the night before, was now lying on the bed. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, casting an eerie, unsettling aura. Amora's breath caught in her throat. She picked it up, her hands shaking. The doll felt cold in her grasp, unnatural. Her heart began to pound as she realized something was terribly wrong. The horror of her actions, the words she had spoken in anger, began to set in. What had she done? Her frustration had caused her to lash out at Nia, her own daughter. And now, the very thing she had feared was happening. Nia was gone, and the clay doll, the very vessel that had brought her into the world, seemed to be holding some kind of sinister power. Amoera stumbled back, her mind reeling. The doll, once a symbol of her hope, now felt like an omen of something darker, a consequence she hadn't understood when she first accepted Nana Asanteo's gift. Nia, she cried, her voice trembling with panic. But there was no answer. The house was silent, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like 1,000 stones. She knew then. She had made a terrible mistake. The cost of her words, the cost of her neglect, was more than she could bear. And as the glow from the doll flickered ominously in her hands, Amoera knew she had to face the consequences of her actions. But would she be able to undo the damage she had caused? Would her daughter ever return to her? The search for answers was only beginning, the price of neglect. The morning after Nia's disappearance, Amoera was consumed by panic. Her heart was heavy with the realization of what had happened, of how her frustration and anger had driven her to lash out at the one person she loved most in the world. The silence that had settled in her house was unbearable, and the weight of Nia's absence pressed on her chest like a suffocating fog. She had no choice. She had to find Nia. And there was only one place to search for answers, the temple of Nana Asantewaa. Amoera knew the journey would be difficult. The path through the forest was treacherous, fraught with hidden dangers, and the creatures that roamed these woods had become more hostile in recent weeks. The air was thick with an ominous energy, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. Amora's steps quickened as the sense of impending doom grew stronger, the weight of the unknown pressing against her. As she moved deeper into the forest, the familiar sounds of the village and its daily life faded into the distance, leaving behind only the eerie sounds of rustling leaves and distant growls. The creatures of the forest seemed to watch her, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, their presence felt rather than seen. Amora's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last. With every turn of the path, the forest grew darker, more oppressive. The once familiar trees seemed to twist and writhe, their branches reaching out like fingers, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Amora's mind raced with the fear that she would never find Nia, that her neglect had driven her daughter into the very heart of the forest where no one would be able to reach her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amora reached the temple, the ancient structure that stood at the heart of the forest, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The once beautiful carvings on the walls of the temple now seemed warped, the serpents twisted into grotesque shapes, their eyes staring down at Amora with cold indifference. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and the stone steps seemed to stretch endlessly upward, leading to a door that beckoned her in. Inside the temple, Nana Asantewa awaited her, her eyes cold and unfeeling. The sorceress sat upon her throne, surrounded by glowing snakes that coiled lazily around her, their tongues flickering as though they sensed Amora's presence. The sorceress's expression was unreadable, her golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. Amora fell to her knees, her body trembling with the weight of her guilt. "Please, Nana Asantewa, please help me. I've made a terrible mistake." Her voice broke as she spoke, her words a desperate plea. "I neglected my daughter. I shouted at her, and now she is gone. I'll do anything you ask, to bring her back. Please, help me." Nana Asantewa remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Amora with an inscrutable expression. The snakes surrounding her swayed gently, their eyes never leaving the trembling woman. Finally, the sorceress spoke, her voice low and cold. "You have broken the pact, Amora. The vessel that I gave you, the child you so desperately sought, is a piece of your soul. You gave life to the child, and in return, you were bound to her. You neglected your bond, and now you have broken that bond. The price is steep." Amora's heart sank as she realized the full extent of her mistake. She had been warned, but in her desperation, she had ignored the warning. The bond between mother and child was sacred, and by failing to honor it, she had invited the wrath of the serpent. "But there is a way to undo the curse," Nana Asantewa continued, her eyes gleaming with a cold, distant knowledge. "You must return to your village and perform a sacrifice, a final offering to the spirits to restore the balance. The clay doll, the vessel that I gave you, must be burned in the village center, in front of your people. You will offer a piece of your soul to the flames, and in return, the child will be restored." Amora's heart raced. The cost was greater than she had imagined, and the thought of what she had to do sent waves of fear through her. To sacrifice a piece of her soul, to burn the very vessel that had brought her joy and pain, was a fate she had never anticipated. But there was no other choice. She had to fix the mistake she had made, to bring Nia back, no matter the cost. Amora rose to her feet, her mind made up. "I will do it." Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I will return to the village. I will burn the doll and offer my soul. Please, let my daughter come back to me." Nana Asantewa's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. "Very well. But remember, Amora, this offering is not without its consequences. The sacrifice will leave a permanent mark on you, a reminder of the price you paid. Do not forget what you have learned today." Amora nodded, the weight of the sorceress's words pressing on her heart. She turned to leave, her steps heavy with the knowledge of what she was about to do. She had no choice. Her daughter's life depended on it, and she would do anything to make things right. The journey back to the village was long, but Amora's mind was focused solely on one thing, the sacrifice she had to make. The flames in the village center would be her final offering, and she would give all that she had to restore the bond she had broken. As she approached the village, the sky was beginning to darken, and the villagers gathered silently in the square, watching her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Amora stepped forward, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she was about to make. In the center of the square, the fire was already prepared. The flames crackled, hungry and fierce, ready to consume whatever was thrown into their depths. Amora walked to the center, the clay doll in her hands. She took a deep breath, her heart aching with the knowledge of what she was about to lose. The villagers watched in silence as Amora placed the doll into the flames. The fire roared, and Amora stepped back, offering up a piece of her soul to the flames. Her heart ached as she watched the doll burn, the final symbol of her desperate wish. She had given everything she had, her heart, her soul, and her love, for this moment. And then, as the flames roared higher, Omoera felt a shift in the air. The fire burned brighter, and from the flames, Nia appeared, standing before her, safe and sound. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she was alive. Omoera rushed forward, tears of relief streaming down her face, and Nia ran into her arms, both mother and daughter clinging to each other, knowing that they had survived the test of love and sacrifice. The bond between them was restored, and the scar on Omoera's heart, as well as the mark on her arm, would remain forever as a reminder of the price she had paid for neglecting that bond. But the most important thing was this: Omoera had learned the most valuable lesson of all, to love unconditionally, to honor the bond with her child, and to never let it slip away again. And for that, she was willing to pay any price. Redemption and sacrifice. The morning had barely broken when Omoera returned to the village, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the ritual she was about to perform. The silence that enveloped her as she walked down the path toward the village square seemed to echo the stillness within her heart. She had never felt so empty, yet so determined. Her mind was consumed by guilt, but the only way forward was through the fire, the very fire that would either break her or redeem her. The villagers had gathered, drawn by the whispers of her actions, the rumors of Nia's disappearance, and the strange happenings that had followed. Omoera barely noticed their eyes on her, their gazes filled with curiosity and judgment. The weight of their expectations was nothing compared to the burden she carried. In the center of the village square, she prepared the ritual. The clay doll lay in her hands, now cold and lifeless, its hollow eyes staring back at her. The same doll that had once represented hope, a new life, now felt like an anchor to the darkest part of her soul. The villagers watched in silence as Omoera knelt beside a roaring bonfire, the flames licking the early morning sky with their fiery tongues. Omoera took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She held the doll above the flames, her hands trembling as the heat radiated against her skin. The wind whispered around her, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She closed her eyes and whispered the words that Nana Asantewa had given her, words that she now fully understood the weight of. From my soul, I give life. With those words, Omoera placed the clay doll into the fire. The flames roared as they devoured the doll, consuming it in an instant. Omoera's eyes followed the doll as it was engulfed by the flames, her mind a whirlwind of regret and fear. Then, as the flames crackled higher, Omoera stepped forward, lifting her hands to the sky. She closed her eyes and offered a piece of herself, her heart, her soul, into the fire. The ritual demanded it, a sacrifice for a life saved. She felt the weight of the offering, a momentary, unbearable pain in her chest as if something deep within her was being torn away. For a brief moment, the fire seemed to grow even stronger, as if it had taken in her sacrifice, and then, as if satisfied, it began to die down, the flames shrinking into embers. Omoera opened her eyes just as the fire began to come, and that's when she saw her, Nia. The little girl stood just beyond the smoke, her eyes wide, filled with tears but glowing with the relief of being alive. Her hair was tousled, and she was dressed in the same clothes Omoera had last seen her in, but now she seemed different. Her small face was streaked with dirt and tears, but there was a light about her, a warmth that spoke of something more than just physical presence. Nia! Omoera cried, her voice trembling with emotion. She rushed toward her daughter, her arms opening wide. Nia ran into her embrace, the two of them colliding in a tight, desperate hug. Omoera held Nia tightly, feeling her heart swell with relief, guilt, and an overwhelming love. I'm so sorry, Omoera whispered through her tears, her voice hoarse. I'll never leave you again. I'll never neglect you. Nia clung to her, but Omoera could feel the hesitation in her small body. Her daughter, though back in her arms, was still holding something back, as though she wasn't fully sure she could trust her mother yet. Omoera's heart broke at the thought that she had caused such a rift between them. After a long moment, Nia spoke softly, her voice shaky. I'm sorry too, Mama." Omoara pulled back slightly, looking down at her daughter's tear-streaked face, her own heart breaking with the weight of the apology. She realized that they both had suffered, but this was a moment for healing, not for blame. From that moment on, Omoara made a vow to never again let the frustrations of motherhood cloud her love for Nia. She would honor her bond with her daughter, no matter the cost. As Omoara stood in the village square, holding Nia in her arms, the villagers began to disperse, but Omoara barely noticed. The eyes that had once judged her were now filled with something else, respect, perhaps even understanding. The gossip that had followed her had died down, replaced by whispers of awe, of the miracle that had just taken place. But there was something more that Omoara had to face, something that would stay with her forever. As she looked down at her daughter, Omoara felt a sharp, sudden pain in her arm, a burning sensation that traveled from her wrist to her elbow. She gasped and looked down to see the unmistakable mark, a serpent-shaped scar winding around her arm, a permanent reminder of her broken bond and the price she had paid. Omoara ran her fingers over the scar, feeling the raised skin. It was dark, ancient-looking, like it had been there forever. In that moment, she understood. The scar was a part of her now, just as the bond between mother and child would be forever etched into her soul. It was a reminder of the mistake she had made, but also a symbol of the redemption she had fought for. A sacrifice, but also a promise. A bond that could never be broken, no matter what. As Omoara and Nia stood together, Nana Asantewa's voice echoed softly in Amora's mind, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. To love is to honor the bond, to neglect is to invite the serpent's wrath. Omoara closed her eyes, the weight of the words settling in her heart. Her journey of redemption had only just begun. She had learned the price of neglecting the bond between mother and child, but now, with Nia in her arms and the scar on her arm as her reminder, Omoara knew she would honor that bond for the rest of her life. And in that moment, with the warmth of her daughter in her arms and the village quietly coming alive around her, Omoara felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace.